Imagine a leader who stood up to America, fought off invasion attempts, survived assassination plots, and turned his small island into a global symbol of defiance. That man was Fidel Castro. But what if I told you that despite all his bold moves, Castro never dared to take back a huge piece of his own country that America still controls to this day? Yes, I'm talking about Guantanamo Bay. The question is, why didn't Castro ever try to take it back? The answer is more shocking than you think. Let's go back in time to understand how this all began. It all started in 1898 when the United States went to war with Spain. The war only lasted a few months, but it changed the destiny of Cuba forever. After defeating Spain, the U.S. promised to help Cuba become independent. But there was a catch. America didn't want to completely let go. In 1903, they forced the Cuban government to sign something called the Platt Amendment. It gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuba whenever they wanted, and it also gave them a piece of Cuban land, Guantanamo Bay, which they could use in perpetuity as a naval base. In perpetuity basically means forever. So the U.S. got permanent control of Guantanamo Bay for just $2,000 in gold per year. That's right, for less than the cost of a used car, the U.S. gained control of one of the most strategically important pieces of land in the Caribbean. Years later, the rent was raised slightly to around $4,000 a year, but even today, it's still laughably small. Fast forward to 1959, a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro overthrows the corrupt U.S.-backed dictator, Fulgencio Batista. The world was shocked. America lost its biggest ally in the Caribbean, and a new, bold, anti-American leader rose to power just 90 miles away from Florida. Castro was furious when he looked at the map of his new Cuba and saw that a chunk of it was still occupied by the Americans. He called Guantanamo Bay a knife stuck in the heart of our land. To him, it wasn't just a base, it was an insult, a reminder that Cuba was once under America's control. You would think the first thing he'd do is take it back, right? But he didn't. Not even once in his 49 years in power did Castro make a serious attempt to reclaim Guantanamo Bay. So why didn't he? To understand that, we have to think like Fidel Castro. When Castro took power, the U.S. was already watching him closely. At first, America wasn't sure what to do with him. But after Castro started nationalizing American businesses in Cuba, meaning he took over U.S.-owned sugar mills, oil refineries, and banks, the relationship collapsed. By 1961, the U.S. had cut all diplomatic ties with Cuba. And in that same year, the CIA launched the Bay of Pigs invasion, a secret plan to overthrow Castro using Cuban exiles trained in America. The invasion failed miserably, but it taught Castro one unforgettable lesson. The U.S. would not hesitate to attack if he gave them a reason. And that's where Guantanamo Bay comes in. Castro realized that if he tried to take Guantanamo by force, the U.S. would use it as an excuse to invade the entire island at Ba. It would be suicide. America had one of the strongest militaries in the world. Guantanamo Bay was not just a small outpost, it was heavily fortified. Thousands of U.S. Marines were stationed there, along with tanks, artillery, and warships nearby. If Cuba attacked the base, the U.S. could wipe out Cuban forces within hours. So instead of fighting for Guantanamo, Castro decided to fight a different kind of battle, a psychological and political one. He turned Guantanamo Bay into a symbol of American imperialism. Every time he gave a speech about U.S. oppression, he pointed to Guantanamo Bay. He used it as proof that America still wanted to control Cuba. And the more he talked about it, the more people around the world began to see the U.S. as a bully. Castro realized something genius. Guantanamo Bay was more powerful to him as a symbol than as a piece of land. But there was more to it. Legally, the U.S. had the upper hand. In 1934, before Castro came to power, a new treaty was signed between Cuba and the U.S. It said that the lease on Guantanamo Bay could only end if both sides agreed to end it. And of course, the U.S. would never agree to that. So even if Cuba wanted it gone, there was no legal way to force America out without starting a war. To make matters worse, the U.S. kept sending Cuba the annual rent checks. But here's the twist. Castro refused to cash them. He didn't want to legitimize the deal. He once said that those checks were a symbol of occupation. The Cuban government kept every single one of them locked away in a desk drawer. The only one that was ever cashed was by accident in the early years of his rule. Imagine that, rent checks for land you can't use piling up for decades. But that's not all. After the Bay of Pigs invasion came the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the closest the world ever came to nuclear war. When the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just miles from Guantanamo Bay, tensions exploded. The US was ready to invade. For 13 terrifying days, the world held its breath. Castro watched as two superpowers nearly destroyed each other over his tiny island. When that crisis ended, he knew one thing for sure. If he ever made a move on Guantanamo Bay, it could start World War III, so he left it alone. Still, the situation around Guantanamo was tense. Cuban and American soldiers stood just a few hundred meters apart, separated by fences, watchtowers, and minefields. For decades, they glared at each other across the border, but no one fired a single shot. In fact, Guantanamo Bay became the only place in the Western Hemisphere surrounded by landmines. Cuba even cut off water and electricity supplies to the base, hoping to make life harder for the Americans. But the US just built its own systems and continued operating independently. Castro could not touch it. Over the years, the base became almost like a frozen reminder of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba lost its biggest ally. But even then, Guantanamo Bay stayed under American control. And then, after 9/11, Guantanamo Bay gained a new controversial reputation. The US turned it into a detention center for suspected terrorists. Suddenly, the name Guantanamo became known all over the world again, not because of Cuba, but because of the prisoners held there. And once again, Castro used it to attack the US in speeches, calling it a prison of shame. Yet, he still didn't try to take it back. Why did that homohag? Because by then he didn't have to. Guantanamo Bay had become a symbol so strong that the world already knew Cuba's side of the story. Castro didn't need to fight a military battle. He had already won the ideological one. And besides, attacking the base would have destroyed everything he built. Cuba's army could never stand up to the US military. It wasn't worth losing thousands of lives for a small patch of land that had no real economic value. The area around Guantanamo is dry, rocky, and isolated. It's not fertile farmland, it's not a rich city, it's just a symbolic piece of territory. So, Castro decided to turn that symbol into power. By leaving the base untouched, he made it a constant reminder of US domination. Every Cuban child grew up knowing that part of their country was occupied, and that made the Cuban Revolution story even stronger. For Castro, that was more useful than starting a war he couldn't win. And that's the irony of it all. The man who stood up to America more than anyone else in modern history never touched Guantanamo Bay, because he was too smart to. He understood that true power isn't always about guns or land. Sometimes it's about perception, influence, and the story you tell the world. Even today, Guantanamo Bay remains under US control. The rent is still around $4,000 a year, and every year the US still sends that check to Havana, and the Cuban government still refuses to cash it. The base still stands as one of the last relics of the Cold War, a place where time seems frozen and history never truly ended. So the next time you hear about Guantanamo Bay, remember this: it's not just a military base. It's a symbol of pride, politics, and power. It's the story of how one man chose to fight his enemy, not with bullets, but with patience and propaganda. Fidel Castro couldn't take Guantanamo Bay by force, but he made sure it would forever remind the world that Cuba never gave up. And maybe that's exactly what he wanted. Because sometimes the smartest move in war is the one you don't make. Now here's a question for you. Do you think Cuba will ever get Guantanamo Bay back? Or will it remain American soil forever? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you found this story fascinating, hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more incredible untold stories from around the world.